Questions lingered, heavy and unspoken, behind the royal gates for weeks, casting a long, suffocating shadow over the royal family. The absence of Prince Louis, the youngest of them all, was a whisper in the halls of the palace that no one could ignore. Why had he suddenly disappeared from public view? Why had he, once a beacon of joy and light in royal appearances, withdrawn without a word of explanation? At first, the absence was subtle, almost too quiet to notice. No one paid much attention. But as the days stretched on, the silence grew louder. Then, just moments ago, King Charles delivered a brief yet profound statement that changed everything. His words were not just emotionally charged, they hinted at a far deeper, more troubling undercurrent building within the monarchy. What had begun as a mere absence of a young child soon became a crisis, a full-fledged issue that threatened the very core of the royal family's public image. It began quietly, without fanfare. No grand speeches, no urgent press conferences. The royal calendar shifted, engagements were subtly rearranged, but the absence remained, stretching out in the background like an unacknowledged shadow. Yet the absence of a young boy who had once brought laughter, energy, and spontaneity into every room was impossible to ignore. Prince Louis was not just a royal child, he was the spark of unpredictability, the source of warmth that softened the rigid structure of royal life. His absence went unnoticed only for so long. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a brief hiatus, perhaps a child sleeping, a family adjusting to a new routine, nothing more than the ebb and flow of everyday life. But as the days turned into weeks, the explanations began to feel hollow. Routine justifications grew harder to maintain. What had originally seemed like a temporary absence was now taking on a much darker tone, like a storm slowly gathering on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. The weeks dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Public appearances continued, but the familiar face of the youngest prince was nowhere to be found. His smile, once a symbol of lightness, was missing from every royal event, every photograph. His absence began to feel like a gaping hole in the fabric of the royal family. The void left behind was filled quickly with whispers, rumors, and wild speculation. People from all over the world pored over each blurred image, each grainy photograph, trying to find something, anything that could explain the silence. And with each passing day, more questions piled on top of the last. Was it a health issue, an accident, a secret injury, or something more sinister hidden away behind the towering walls of the palace? What was the real reason for his disappearance? As the palace maintained its silence, the rumors only grew louder. The speculation reached fever pitch, and the family found itself cornered with nowhere to hide from the relentless pressure. Finally, it wasn't until this afternoon that the situation was finally addressed, though by then the public's hunger for answers had reached a breaking point. When King Charles stepped onto the stage, the air in the room seemed to shift instantly. His usual confidence, the polished composure that defined him as a monarch, was gone. In its place was a somber, almost solemn air. His voice, normally steady and authoritative, was quieter, slower. It carried the weight of something far more serious than anyone had expected. It wasn't just about a missing child anymore. It was about something much larger, a failure at the heart of the monarchy itself. And for the first time, King Charles spoke not just of an absent child, but of a deeper, more troubling failure. A failure to protect, to care for, to shield. His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The atmosphere shifted in the room, growing thick with tension. It became clear that this was no longer about a child missing from the royal spotlight. It was about a monarchy grappling with its own responsibility. No longer was this simply a matter of privacy or medical absence. Charles had admitted something much more significant. He was admitting fault, acknowledging a deeper failure that had remained hidden for far too long. His words weren't just expressions of regret, they were confessions. There was a quiet, powerful weight behind them. The tension was palpable. Senior aides, usually composed and confident, shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact, their discomfort clear. They knew what had been hidden, what had been orchestrated behind the scenes. Louis's disappearance was no accident. It had been carefully controlled, intentionally kept out of sight. What had once been a small issue, easily explained away, had now become something far more complicated and troubling. A matter that no one could afford to ignore any longer. The room seemed to hold its breath as the full weight of King Charles' words settled in. It was no longer just a medical absence, it was something far deeper, something that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And yet there was a growing sense that the royal family had been fighting not just to maintain control over the narrative, but to keep a much darker truth from surfacing. Behind closed doors, before the public even caught wind of Louis's absence, there had been quiet conversations, hushed tones, and veiled concerns. Subtle changes had been noticed, patterns that hadn't quite added up. What had been brushed aside as insignificant anomalies now looked very different in hindsight. Medical consultations had been held in secrecy, away from the usual palace doctors, and the atmosphere in Louis's nursery had shifted, a subtle change that hadn't gone unnoticed by those who worked closely with him. Where there had once been boundless energy and enthusiasm, there was now quiet apprehension. As the days passed, Catherine too had begun to seek answers. Her worry grew not only for Louis's well-being but for what might lie ahead. She consulted experts in secret away from the palace's usual medical system. She wasn't seeking answers from public royal doctors but from private confidential sources that would never appear in the press and whose findings would remain hidden behind the palace's grand walls. It was not about fear of the diagnosis itself. It was about what would happen when the truth finally emerged. Catherine, once known for her grace and composure, now found herself privately grappling with emotions she had never been forced to confront. The silence that had been carefully cultivated by the palace began to crack, and as it did, Catherine's anxiety became a very real, very public issue. The pressure mounted, the silence growing heavier with each passing day, and then Louis collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic fall, not a sudden catastrophe, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the household. There were no signs leading up to it, no warnings, no obvious reasons. A routine play session, one that should have been mundane, suddenly became a crisis. Medical personnel were called in, but by the time they arrived, Louis had regained consciousness. It wasn't the collapse itself that changed everything, though. It was what followed. Something shifted in the family dynamics. The private decision to withdraw from public life wasn't made out of convenience, but out of necessity. Catherine, determined to protect her child, took the reins. She withdrew, pulling back from the public eye, keeping Louis safe from the harsh spotlight that had followed them for so long. But behind the palace walls, the tension was only beginning to grow. Catherine's decision to keep Louis's condition private was not met with understanding from everyone. Camilla, whose role as the queen consort seemed to be expanding, quickly began to take issue with Catherine's decision. The palace's growing silence was seen as a problem by those who believed it needed to be controlled, not hidden. Catherine, however, was adamant. She was not shielding her son from public scrutiny because of shame. She was protecting him, and in the process, she was challenging the monarchy's long-standing need for control, for perfection, for appearances above all else. It was not an easy battle, nor was it one that would be won quietly. In the midst of this internal turmoil, King Charles spoke once again, and for the first time in a long time, he stood not as a monarch, but as a father, a grandfather. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation, not just for the monarchy, but for his family. His decision to step back from royal duties to give Louis a childhood free from the pressures of the crown was not one made lightly. It was a decision that rocked the foundations of the royal family, but it was one that signified a profound shift. The monarchy was no longer simply an institution. It was a family, human and flawed, willing to change in the face of crisis. And as the public saw this unfold, they didn't just witness a royal family under duress. They saw a family finding its humanity. The monarchy, once an untouchable, distant institution, became something far more relatable. The public's sympathy poured in. The royal family, with all its flaws and vulnerabilities, had finally broken free from the chains of secrecy and perfection. Before the public even became aware, the whispers of concern had already started circulating quietly within the royal family, growing louder with each passing day. For weeks, subtle shifts in behavior and small, unnoticed changes had been occurring, things that couldn't be overlooked no matter how much the palace tried to keep them under wraps. These weren't simply signs of a child's occasional illness. They were symptoms of something much deeper, something far more troubling. The very foundation of the royal family was beginning to crack, and behind the high walls of the palace, Catherine and the family were already beginning to take action. Medical appointments were scheduled in private, away from the public eye. But instead of relying on the usual familiar royal doctors, they turned to discreet outside experts, trusted individuals who would keep the information contained within the walls of the family. The royal medical system, known to the world and always under public scrutiny, was not an option. They needed answers, but Catherine and the family feared the repercussions of those answers being exposed to the world too soon. In the shadows, Catherine had already begun consulting specialists behind closed doors. Her fear, however, wasn't about the diagnosis itself. It was not the medical condition that caused her distress. What truly terrified her were the consequences that would come from exposing the truth. It wasn't shame she was grappling with, but the overwhelming realization that the truth, once revealed, would be twisted, misrepresented, and distorted by the public. The world wasn't ready to hear the full extent of what was happening, not yet, and certainly not in the way it needed to be understood. The world was simply too eager to jump to conclusions, to sensationalize what they could not yet comprehend. Catherine understood this all too well. She feared what would happen when the truth inevitably came to light. The internal tension inside the royal household was becoming unbearable, like a storm brewing on the horizon with no way of knowing when it would strike. It wasn't until one quiet afternoon that everything changed, when Louis, with no warning, suddenly collapsed. There were no signs, no symptoms leading up to it. One minute everything was fine and the next chaos erupted. A medical team was called immediately, racing to his side, but by the time they arrived, Louis had regained consciousness. The immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Louis appeared physically fine, but something had shifted profoundly in that moment. It wasn't about his physical health, it was about the emotional toll that had taken place in those few moments. Something deep and irrevocable had changed. Catherine's heart raced as she immediately reached for her phone and called William. Within an hour, they had made a quiet, yet monumental decision to withdraw entirely from their public duties. The palace, once so full of life and activity, fell into an eerie silence. There were no public updates, no statements to the press, no official comments made to explain what was going on. For the first time, the royal family retreated completely from the public gaze. For Catherine, this wasn't about defying the monarchy's traditions or flouting protocol. It was about taking control of the situation before the narrative spun out of their hands. She needed clarity. She needed answers. She needed peace for herself, for Louis, and for their family. No longer would they allow the world to speculate, to gossip, to assume things that weren't true. They were not ready to share the truth yet, but they needed time, and they needed the space to figure out what was really happening. The silence, however, wasn't a sign of apathy. It wasn't the palace simply ignoring the situation. It was born out of fear. Fear of what might be exposed. Fear of what could happen if the truth became public too soon. The royal family, so often seen as invulnerable and untouchable, was now faced with a situation it couldn't control. The burden of secrecy had become a weight too heavy to carry. And as Catherine withdrew, as she chose to shield Louis from the pressure of the media and public scrutiny, the internal tensions inside the family only grew. With each passing day, the situation became more fraught, more difficult to manage. Camilla, who had already been stepping into a more prominent role in the royal family's public affairs, quickly began to exert more influence over how the situation was portrayed to the public. Her response, however, was far less understanding. She took on the task of controlling the messaging, of framing the situation in a way that would protect the monarchy, even if it meant hiding the truth. Catherine, however, felt betrayed. This wasn't a matter of public relations or how the family would be perceived. This was about her son's future, his safety, and his well-being. This was not a situation that could be spun, altered, or controlled for the sake of appearances. It was her child's life that was at stake. As the tension continued to mount, Catherine found herself torn between two worlds: the world of royal duty with its incessant need for control and optics, and the world of a mother who was desperately trying to protect her child from the prying eyes of the public. This battle wasn't about media narratives or palace politics. It was about real life, about real consequences, and the future of the youngest member of the royal family. And Catherine was determined to ensure that Louis's future would not be determined by the pressures of royalty, but by the love and care of his family. In the weeks that followed, the palace grew quieter. Each day brought more speculation, more rumors. Catherine's decision to shield Louis from the public eye was met with increasing pressure, both internally and externally. And as she took control of the situation, her relationship with Camilla grew increasingly strained. Camilla's desire to control the message, to keep the narrative in line with royal expectations, clashed directly with Catherine's desire to protect her child from the world's judgment. What began as a disagreement over messaging soon evolved into a far more personal conflict. Catherine, who had always been the epitome of grace and poise, found herself in a position she had never anticipated, fighting not for royal protocol, but for her child's future, his well-being, and his safety. This was not a battle Catherine ever expected to face, but it was one she had to fight for Louis and for the royal family's future. The stakes were higher than ever, and Catherine knew that she could no longer sit idly by while the world continued to speculate, gossip, and pry. It was time to take back control of her family's story, and she would do whatever it took to make sure Louis's truth was told on their terms, not the world's. It wasn't just the media that struggled to understand the situation. Catherine's internal struggle became an emotional odyssey, one that no one, least of all herself, had anticipated. What was being uncovered wasn't just a simple issue. It was a profound, painful revelation that would change everything. And when Catherine's emotions finally cracked under the pressure, it didn't happen in front of a camera or an audience. It happened in the quiet of her home, in the safety of her personal space, away from the prying eyes of the world. For years, Catherine had been the picture of royal composure, unflappable, poised, and graceful under the harshest of pressures. She had weathered scandal, public scrutiny, and the weight of her duties with unwavering elegance. But no one could carry the constant weight of secrecy, the burden of living a life concealed in the shadows. No one, not even Catherine, could hold up forever under the strain of guarding a truth too painful to expose. One evening, as Louis looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes, his voice broke the quiet tension. "Mommy, will I be all right?" he asked, a simple question that carried the weight of all her fears. In that moment, Catherine's heart shattered. The purity of his question, the vulnerability in his voice, shattered the delicate composure she had so carefully maintained. Tears fell freely, not just for Louis, but for everything she had been forced to endure in silence. The secrets, the lies, the pressure to maintain an image of perfection. She wept for the child she so desperately wanted to protect, and for herself, who had been trapped in a role too restrictive for her humanity to thrive. The moment of emotional release was a turning point. It was a breaking point that would give rise to a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. Catherine made a radical choice, one that defied centuries of tradition and expectations. She formally requested that Louis be permanently removed from any future royal responsibilities. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it wasn't a statement of defiance against the monarchy. It was a mother's desperate plea for her child's peace and safety. It was the most personal and vulnerable decision Catherine had ever made. The ripple effects of that choice would be felt throughout the palace and beyond. For some, it was a necessary step. For others, it was destabilizing, even dangerous. But for Catherine, it was simply the only choice she could make to protect her son. King Charles, despite the internal pressure and the political ramifications, stood firm beside her. He understood the gravity of the situation. In an uncharacteristically transparent moment, he addressed the royal family, acknowledging that Louis's childhood must be shielded from the harsh spotlight. This wasn't just about safeguarding the monarchy's image. It wasn't about protecting the crown's legacy or reputation. This was about protecting a child beneath a title, about honoring Louis's right to a childhood free from the unrelenting public gaze. When Charles made his statement, it marked a significant shift in royal policy. For the first time in years, the monarchy appeared human, vulnerable, and deeply flawed. The emotion in his words reverberated across the room, touching something deeper than the politics of royalty. It became clear that this wasn't about tradition or public duty, it was about family. It was about a father, a grandfather, standing up and doing what was right for his family, no matter the cost to the institution he had dedicated his life to. In the wake of this unprecedented moment, the monarchy was no longer just an institution. It had become a symbol of vulnerability, of human emotion, and of the power that honesty holds in times of crisis. The royal family's quiet withdrawal from the public eye became a statement in itself. It wasn't about avoiding the press, it was about reclaiming their humanity. It was about putting family before the crown, about recognizing that there was more to life than royal duties and ceremonial roles. Catherine, in the depths of her grief and her protective love for Louis, found a new purpose. She took that pain and turned it into something greater: advocacy for those facing similar struggles, for families battling in silence with challenges that the world so often overlooks. Her grief became the catalyst for change, not just within the royal family, but in how the world saw them. What had once been seen as an untouchable, distant institution was now a family struggling through real human pain, and in that pain they found a new strength. Catherine's decision, her willingness to shield her son, was a reminder that even in the most high-profile of families, vulnerability has the power to heal and redefine the course of history. The world's response was swift and overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from every corner of the globe. Families shared their own stories, their struggles, their words of encouragement. Catherine's courage in speaking out, in confronting the harsh reality of her son's condition, transformed what was once a deeply personal tragedy into a cause that resonated with people everywhere. Her vulnerability became a universal fight, one that transcended royal titles and touched the hearts of those who had once only watched from afar. She had turned her pain into advocacy, her grief into a powerful message that called attention to issues that were often hidden in the shadows. Then the unthinkable happened. In a moment that no one could have anticipated, William, not as a monarch but as a father, stood in front of a podium and spoke from the heart. There were no scripts, no advisors whispering in his ear. It was just him, raw and unguarded, pouring his emotions out for the world to hear. "I asked too many questions about what this means for the monarchy," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of the moment. "Now I just want to know what it means for my son." That single emotional statement marked a pivotal turning point, not just for the royal family but for the monarchy itself. For years, the royals had been defined by their cold, calculated formality. They had maintained an image of distance, of impenetrable grace, with emotions rarely showing through the facade. But in that moment, William broke through the years of royal tradition. The public, watching from their screens, no longer saw them as distant figures on a throne. They saw them as human beings, parents just like them, struggling through the same fears, doubts, and grief. The monarchy had shed its rigid, impersonal outer shell and embraced the raw power of vulnerability. In the aftermath of William's speech, Charles, too, found himself reckoning with the weight of the family's situation. In a rare moment of personal reflection, he made a decision that was as unprecedented as it was profound. He withdrew not as the monarch who carried centuries of tradition on his shoulders, but as a grandfather. He made the choice to remove Louis from the public eye entirely, ensuring that his childhood would be his own, free from the relentless pressures of the crown. It was a decision that no one could have predicted, but one that spoke volumes about the direction the royal family was now headed. In their collective grief, the royal family found solidarity. They were no longer divided by their roles and titles, but united by something much deeper, a love for a child who had come to symbolize far more than just his royal lineage. Louis, in his vulnerability, had become a symbol of change, a living testament to the power of love, compassion, and the willingness to evolve. He was no longer just the youngest prince, he had become a catalyst for a transformation within the monarchy itself. But despite the unity that had formed, a question remained. What did this mean for the future of the monarchy? What did it mean for an institution that had been built on centuries of tradition, on a legacy that stretched back through history? The royal family had made their choice, and in doing so, they had irrevocably altered the trajectory of their future. They had chosen humanity over legacy, and in that choice, they had rewritten the very rules that had once bound them. Catherine's decision to shield Louis from the spotlight was not just a personal one. It was a challenge to the monarchy itself. The crown had always been seen as an unyielding institution, a symbol of tradition and continuity. But in that moment, the monarchy was no longer just an institution, it was a family. A family that, for the first time in a long while, recognized the need to adapt, to shift with the changing tides of tea. It was no longer about the crown first. It was about the family, the people, the ones who were meant to be protected by the crown. The monarchy had to adapt if it were to survive, to ensure the future of those it vowed to protect. What had once been an unbreakable institution was now a living, breathing entity, one that had to grow, change, and evolve to meet the needs of the family it served. This was no longer about tradition, it was about survival. It was about love, sacrifice, and a commitment to a future that was far more human than anyone could have imagined.